Now we're going to turn our attention in this chapter to a portfolio and the risk and return associated with such. What's a portfolio? A portfolio is a group of assets held simultaneously by an investor. A portfolio's expected return is just a weighted average of the return of the portfolio's component parts, the assets within that portfolio. On the other hand, standard deviation is not the appropriate risk for a portfolio. So, for a portfolio, we can calculate expected return. That will be just a weighted average of the assets within the portfolio. To measure risk in a portfolio context, standard deviation is not the appropriate measure. And momentarily, we will talk about what is the appropriate measure in a portfolio context. So let's look at expected rate of return. As I mentioned previously, the expected rate of return on a portfolio is simply a weighted average, and this is the formula that we are going to use. There are going to be a number of investments within that portfolio. Each one of those investments or assets will have an expected return. All of those expected returns, each one will be multiplied by the weight that it holds in that portfolio. We will take the weight of an asset, multiply it times its expected return. We will do that for all of the assets within that portfolio. We will then take all of those products and add them together. Now, in our previous mini lecture, we talked about finding the expected return on individual assets. So we know how to find R hat sub I. What are the weights, however, in this formula? The weights represent how much money we have invested in each one of the individual assets in comparison to the total portfolio value. So, in other words, each weight is a ratio. It's a proportion of the total portfolio value that's invested in each one of the assets making up that portfolio. We can talk about the appropriate measure of risk in a portfolio context. We might need a little foundation in the concept of correlation. Correlation relates to how two variables move together. So let's say that we have two stocks and their returns. We have stock W and stock M. It just so happens that these two stocks have perfect negative correlation. What does that mean? That means that when one has a positive 10% return, the other has a negative 10% return. So they're moving in exact opposite directions in terms of their returns. If we hold each one of these two stocks, which is W and M, if you hold them separately, you put all your money in one or all your money in the other, on average, your expected rate of return is 15%. Furthermore, each one is individually risky. However, when you combine these two risky assets, the return now is still the same as if you were holding each individually. So the return stays the same, but the risk evaporates. The reason why is because they have perfect negative correlation. A positive return for one stock is canceled out by a negative return on the other. And you can see on the right-hand side of this graphic that when you hold each one separately, the expected rate of return is 15%, but the variation of returns is from minus 10% to plus 40%. You see that distribution of returns. It's quite variable, so that represents the riskiness. But when you combine them together and you put half your money in one and half your money in the other, the rate of return stays the same at 15%, but there is no more risk. When you look at the distribution, there is no distribution. There is no bump there. The risk is eliminated because of that perfect negative correlation. They cancel each other out. Now, what happens if you had two stocks that had perfect positive correlation? That means they moved in exactly the same direction. So if you held them separately, you put all your money in one or all your money in the other, your expected return is 15% and you have a certain measure of risk. If you combine the two stocks and you put half your money in one and half your money in the other, the return stayed the same, but so did the riskiness. Why? Because of this correlation. These two stocks have perfect positive correlation. They are moving in exactly the same direction. Now, what about when we have partial correlation? They're not moving exactly in the same direction, but not in the opposite direction either. So when you put all your money in one or all your money in the other, your expected return is 15%, and we do have quite a variation in returns. But when you put half your money in one and half your money in the other and form a portfolio, the expected return is the same, and some of your risk disappears. Why? Because of that partial correlation. And look at the variability of returns. That distribution in the top graph on the right is flatter. There's more variability. But when you combine the two, the return is the same, but we have a much steeper graph. We don't have as much variation in returns. So that's a good thing. That tells me that as you add more and more stocks to your portfolio, the chances are that you're going to reduce your risk. So most stocks are positively correlated. In other words, they're not that first graph, they're not the second, but most of them lie with that third graph. Combining stocks in a portfolio generally lowers your risk. Risk is made up of two sources: market risk and diversifiable risk. Market risk is that part of a security's risk that you just can't get rid of. It cannot be eliminated by diversification. You can't eliminate it by holding more stocks or more varied stocks. And market risk is measured by beta. Diversifiable risk is that portion of a security's risk that can be eliminated by diversification. So I would like you to watch in the video reviews the concept clip that further explains what the concept of diversification is all about. So, if an investor chooses not to diversify and to put all of his or her wealth in just one asset, are they compensated for bearing this extra risk, this diversifiable risk? No. The market views investors as being smart enough to diversify. So there is no compensation, no benefit to holding diversifiable risk. So why would anyone hold it? We already know that investors are risk averse. They don't like risk. The only reason they will bear a burden of risk is if they're compensated adequately to bear it. So if there's no compensation for bearing that sort of risk, for bearing market risk, they're not going to hold it. So no compensation is earned for holding unnecessary or diversifiable risk. So the only risk that's relevant in a portfolio context is market risk. And the way we measure market risk is through something called beta.